Alrighty, welcome in everyone to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Wednesday, January 15th around here, and we have a great show for you today. Going to take a little bit of a hiatus from all the national title talk, and tomorrow will be an entire national title talk. We will do it in my picks, we'll do matchups, we'll do storyline, we'll do everything around the national title tomorrow, but I do want to get into a little talk around some different things going on around college football, and I'll start with the first year of the CFP. I'll give a little bit of a report card how both the expansionist and anti-expansionist side have very good arguments coming out of this year for why it should go different directions. I'll give my full pick on that and give my full grade on the first year of the CFP. Then we'll get into the Big Ten and the SEC and just how long will the Big Ten's reign last over the college football world, and why are some of the things happening in the sport like NIL kind of leaning towards that direction a little bit more so than the SEC. And then we'll get to a little bit of a head coaching wrap up, and I put a question mark next to the wrap up because I'm not necessarily sure it's fully wrapped up, but we'll look at the biggest head coaching hires in the Power Four and the Group of Five, in coordinator hires that are absolutely huge, and then just some final names to watch, a couple of guys that are still out there that could be looking for jobs, but I'd be a little bit surprised. Then we'll get back to the national title just a little bit. We'll talk about how each team got here, take a look back at the seasons for Ohio State and Notre Dame, look at the storylines, look at a lot of different things that happened for them throughout this year, and then we got some questions for the national title coming up. Definitely some big time ones, including can Notre Dame handle Jeremiah Smith? Going to be probably the biggest question as you head into this one, but definitely something to watch. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question to the front of the line on the screen so we can have a fun back and forth here is to use that super chat. At the bottom of the chat on the Sports Network page, you can click that $, add any question, comment you like. It'll pop up on the screen and we can have a fun back and forth here. Definitely want this to be as interactive as possible, so utilize that and we can have a fun back and forth. But let's go ahead and jump into this thing because the 12-team playoff is coming to an end. You know, we have the national title on Monday, and hopefully this does help this a little bit. You know, maybe it'll bump it up a couple of different grades, but at the end of the day, I feel like it's a good time to take a step back and look at the first year of the 12-team playoff. Look at what it gave us, what it took away from us, some different pros and cons, and some different expansionist and anti-expansionist arguments. And frankly, I think when you look back at this thing, I think there's arguments on both sides. I think you very well could make the argument that it was not a great thing for different parts of the sport. You could easily argue it was fantastic for different parts of the sport, and I'm a little bit confused as well. I'm kind of in between these two, so I'll give you my grade at the end of this, but I did want to get into the expansionist arguments. You know, what they're pulling from this one to say this was a great move. This was something that absolutely had to happen, and these are reasons why it had to happen. So the biggest one that people have been throwing around is Ohio State and Notre Dame wouldn't have been in the 14 playoff. We saw a couple of different rankings at the very end. It was Notre Dame 5, it was Ohio State 6, so they would have been those two teams right on the outside looking in. Now, I have said in the past that I do think Notre Dame might have slid in, and maybe even Ohio State might have slid in over Penn State and Texas after those games, but at the end of the day, we don't know that. What we do know is they were ranked 5 and 6 in the last rankings, so they wouldn't have been in the 14 playoff. And now, and they've made a run to a title. So that's kind of the big time question. You know, a lot of people, this is what they wanted from the 12-team playoff, was teams that hypothetically can stumble from time to time throughout the year, even at the end of the year, like Ohio State did with Michigan, and then find their footing and really become the team that they're more than capable of being, make it to the national title, and enjoy that spotlight. So it is kind of a battle back and forth. I do tend to believe that the selection process would have gone a little bit differently if it was the 4-team playoff. I'm not saying I don't know if Ohio State would have got in. I feel fairly confident that Notre Dame would have found their way in there, but at the end of the day, regardless, it is a show of what this 12 team can give us. You know, teams that might have not had the best year, might have stumbled at different points, might have been a little bit all over the place, definitely have found their way back to the top, and you can make the argument that will give us not a, true champion of the sport, because they will have losses on the schedule. They won't have been dominant from tip to tail, but that's college football. I don't think that's necessarily something that really will keep me up at night, and I don't think it should keep much of anyone up at night at the end of the day. So both these teams would have missed out on the 14 playoff. They find their way to the national title, and every expansionist would tell you that is exactly what they wanted from this thing. So they might have not wanted Notre Dame and Ohio State to be those two teams, but they absolutely did want a team that stumbled in the year and found their footing to be able to make it to a run to a national title, and that's exactly what we got this year. Another one is more meeting on different games. And this is a kind of an interesting argument that really could be argued with anti-expansionists as well, could make this argument just as easily, because I do think there was more emphasis put on certain games, like SMU playing down the stretch. That SMU Pitt game was massive. It was two teams that were very much still in the conversation for the CFP, that were battling for a spot in that ACC title, and it was a huge game over there in Dallas. Obviously, SMU kind of rolled them, but at the end of the day, it carried on throughout the sport. Boise State, we were watching essentially every week, not only to see what Ashton Genty would do, but to see if they could make the CFP. Arizona State, the exact same way, and Iowa State, Kansas State, all of these teams that, reality, when you get to the 9th, 10th week of the season in past years, you're probably not tuning in too much. Now, I'm tuning in because I'm a crazy person and I absolutely love just every inch of this sport. So the reality is it's somewhat a difference of style between fans, but I do think it did give a little bit more shine to some teams that deserve a little bit more shine. This college football world has been so around the Big Two in the SEC and the Big Ten. It still very much is, and we'll talk about that in the next segment. But overall, you look at this season, I think a lot more people know a lot more about the ACC and the Big 12 than they did in the past years, because the 12-team playoff gave them a reason to tune into these teams. So the month of November was as spread as I've ever seen it before, and I think it was a great thing for the sport. Now, you could easily argue that it took away value from other games, and that's something we'll talk about here in a second, but I will say, being able to see SMU be appointment television, being able to see Boise State and Arizona State be appointment television is a really cool thing, and is very good for the sport, especially as the top two just kind of gain all this power and kind of take over the sport in a lot of ways. And then the incredible semifinal games is one that a lot of people are throwing out there, and it's not necessarily because, we wouldn't get this in the 4-team. We obviously missed the mark in a couple of different years. Last year we had two great ones, but at the end of the day, you do look at this and say, in a 12-team playoff, these teams have the ability to get their feet under them. They have the ability to kind of fight through some different things and maybe not play their best football to start this thing, but finally hit their stride and really play great football down the stretch, and maybe it'll make for tighter games in the semifinal games. Maybe these teams won't have that entire month off and then have to jump into a big-time game, and then you could lead to a couple of blowouts here and there. But on the other side of this, you have Texas that has been able to get ready and be able to play a couple of games before Ohio State. You have Ohio State that was able to play Tennessee and play Oregon and get their feet under them, and they didn't really need that, to be totally fair, but it did give an ability for both these teams to know what they're doing wrong, know what they're doing right, and attack at the at the fullest extent. So I do think it was a very fun thing. I do think it's something that will help these games be a little bit tighter down the stretch, and a big reason why I'm not necessarily saying the national title is going to be some type of blowout, because I think both these teams have found their stride throughout this thing, and I think it's going to be really hard to be able to pull away from these teams just because of how crisp they're playing at this very moment. Now, the flip side of that argument is you're playing too much football. You're getting these guys a little bit hurt, and frankly, I probably want to talk about that on Friday in a little bit more detail, but it's definitely something to think about. But these incredible semifinal games are absolutely an argument that the 12-team playoff is doing what it was designed to do. But then you have the anti-expansion group that absolutely has plenty of arguments as well coming out of this thing. The early round blowouts is probably the biggest one of the bunch, and it's one that I've talked about a little bit, and it's one I don't care about, if I'm being totally honest, because you want to look around every single playoff scenario, including NFL wildcard this past weekend. We got one good game. That's the reality of playoffs in a lot of different respects, where we got that Buccaneers-Commanders game, and that was about it. Now, it's not to say that, we don't have great games from different times in the NFL wildcard or in early rounds of playoffs, and I think we will have them in the CFP, but you look at the first round of the CFP, no elite games, not by any means, but I don't necessarily think that's an indictment of the postseason. I don't think that's something that will bury the 12-team, and I think it's something that was happening in the 4-team was definitely going to happen in the 12-team, so if you didn't expect that, I don't know what to tell you, if I'm being totally honest. But anti-expansionist group will absolutely push this and say this is a big-time reason they'll push for doing away with auto buys, do away with different things that create a little bit more of a gap between these first-round matchups. Then you do have the title is proof that there is diminished importance on the regular season. It just is. So you have a Notre Dame team that lost to NIU. You have an Ohio State team that lost to Michigan at the very end of the year. There is a lot of people, and I'm sort of in this group. I kind of battle back and forth in this, that if those things are going to happen, if you're going to allow a Michigan team that has essentially no pass game to beat you, if you're going to allow an NIU team where you were coming off a win over A&M to beat you on your home field, maybe you don't deserve a chance to compete for a national title. So that's kind of the other argument that you can have, is the regular season for these teams in particular, not necessarily for the grandiose respect, but for these teams in particular, was diminished a little bit. The importance of every single game was diminished a little bit because Ohio State found their way in with 2 losses against, and especially one at the very end of the year that every single other year would have buried them. There's no doubt about that. And then NIU is one that it would have buried Notre Dame. And every single other year, even if they win 11-1, a lot of people will be arguing that they don't deserve to be in. It would have been an argument a little bit more so for Notre Dame, but it is proof that that Michigan loss, that NIU loss do not mean nearly as much as they used to mean. And it is proof that a lot of the worries of the diminished regular season, at least in certain circumstances for certain teams, is kind of coming to fruition. So we can argue back and forth on that. I think it's obviously a little bit more important for teams in the ACC and the Big 12, but it's a little less important for teams like Ohio State, Notre Dame, even Texas, Georgia, a couple of those teams that can bounce back from a couple of losses and still find their way in, and then they really hit their stride and win a national title. So this is one where you can go back and forth on, but it is proof that for certain teams, these regular season games don't mean quite as much as they used to mean. This is the most important one to me, at least in my estimation, that we have to find a way to keep energy in conferences. We have to find a way to keep the necessary energy in those championship games, because those should matter. Winning the SEC, winning the Big 10, winning the Big 12, winning the ACC, winning the AAC, winning the Sun Belt, all of that stuff should really matter, because that's what college football is. College football is conferences. College football is, it's not anymore, but in a lot of ways, it is regionality. It is beating the people that are right around you, and it's being able to stand on top of the mountaintop, not of the sport overall, but of the guys around you, of your peers, and that is a big deal. We have to find a way to keep a little bit of energy in this one, and it obviously was a disadvantage this year. You know, Oregon played a great game against Penn State, and then they get the toughest draw of anyone in the tournament, while Penn State gets the easiest draw. So there is an argument here, and it's definitely one that I very much hold. You know, I want conference championships to mean as much as possible. I want them to mean everything in this sport, and this year they just didn't as much, and that's a very upsetting thing and something we're going to have to deal with going forward. But overall, there's arguments on both sides, no doubt about it, and there was always going to be arguments on both sides. It'll take a couple of years for us to figure out exactly what this is going to look like, exactly the pros and cons, at least in no uncertain terms. But the way that I look at this first season, and the grade that I would give this first season for the 12-team playoff, is a C+. I think it was great. I think it was fun. I no doubt about it. I think we did some great things. I think there were some not so great things. You know, you had those first round blowouts. You had a couple of things that made it a little bit less fun, a little bit less entertaining, a little bit less interesting, and I do think there are massive issues with the format. I do think you have to do away with auto buys. Overall seeding might need to change, maybe reseeding, maybe change with the home games and that type of thing, but overall, I think we did a good job. For the first year in the 12-team playoff, I think they did a good job. I think we've had some incredible games. I would pick the same 12 teams, and I would have it play out the same way, and I would have no problem with that. But there are issues to figure out. There are things that are keeping this from being the best version of a playoff that it possibly could be, and not affecting the regular season as much as you would like it to. It's obviously going to impact it some, but definitely would like to tamper that down as much as possible. So I do think the pros outweigh the cons just by a little bit. I've had an incredible amount of fun doing this, and frankly, to start this year, I was not a 12-team playoff guy. I did not love the idea. Coming out of this year, I don't necessarily love it. It's not the perfect way I would go about business, but it is a lot better. It is something that I think much highlier of, and I do think it did a great job in the first year, but there are issues to figure out. So I have it at a C+. I think it's right above that average. I do think next year it could be a B+, and then after that it could be an A+. I really do think there are very concrete, very easy things to kind of flip over. Auto buy system, finding a way to give more credence to conference champions, whatever that looks like, finding a way to kind of smooth over the edges. I think this could be an A-plus product in a couple of years. But right now, we still have some kinks to work out. It was a great year, and I hope it finishes off very, very strong. But definitely some things to figure out, and we'll obviously talk about a couple of those things in a little bit more depth as they unfold. But let's get our first break here, and when we come back, let's talk about that Big Ten versus SEC battle that is going on right now. The Big Ten has taken control of the sport. The question now becomes, how long will it last? Will it only get greater over time, or will it kind of bounce back and forth between the big two? And we'll talk about that right after this, so stick with us.